Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. At the Housing Justice Center, we spent a lot of time working to preserve affordable housing and to keep people in their homes. And I can tell that this issue of displacement of low-income residents is seeping into the public consciousness because my friends all the time are asking me about things they see in the headlines, whether it's a big apartment building that got upscaled and everybody got kicked out, or a manufactured home park that just closed down, or residents who have to move due to no fault of their own because their landlord did such a lousy job maintaining the property that it's no longer fit to inhabit. Clearly, the issue of involuntary displacement of low-income residents has emerged in a big way in the Twin Cities. Earlier this year, a group of organizations called the Fair Housing Implementation Council, which are city and county jurisdictions in the metro area that have fair housing responsibilities, asked us to do some work around steps that local governments could take to address this issue. So we did a lot of research, issued a report that came out this summer, and that's what we're going to talk about this afternoon. Involuntary displacement takes many forms, as you know. In some cases, you simply have to move because the rent has gone up to a level you can no longer afford. Sometimes this is in connection with the upscaling of your building, where the owner is redoing everything and trying to appeal to a different demographic. We also see tenants simply being required to move based on a notice to non-renew their lease. No reason, no cause that they are aware of. Other instances, buildings get converted or demolished and redeveloped, causing people to leave their housing. Even federally and publicly subsidized housing can present this issue where the use restrictions and income restrictions expire and the property converts to market rate. In addition, manufactured home parks, which is actually the largest supply of affordable housing without any public subsidy in the state, are at risk, and a number of them have closed in recent years in the metro area and around the state. And finally, in some cases, low-income homeowners simply struggle to stay in their homes as their property taxes rise to unaffordable levels. One of the things that increasingly became clear over the last couple of years too is that displacement is a fair housing issue because it limits fair housing choice, because it limits your choice of staying where you want to stay. A big part of this problem in the Twin Cities these days has also produced our latest acronym. We're really big on acronyms in the affordable housing field. So the latest is NOAH. Naturally occurring affordable housing, which is the name that's been given to plain old vanilla apartment buildings, older buildings, typically Class C and D properties, often built 50 years ago or more. And it is the supply of housing that most lower income households in the metro area rely upon. And one which until recently, I think we as a region and policymakers have largely taken for granted. But now we are facing the prospect of this supply rapidly diminishing. If you think of NOAH housing in a box, we're losing it out the top from properties where the rents go above levels that are affordable, and we're losing it out the bottom from properties that are not being maintained, and so tenants don't have decent housing. So it's a supply of housing very much at risk these days. Probably the prime example of the loss of NOAH housing was the Crossroads Apartments in Richfield, recently renamed the Concierge, which tells you a lot right there. This 698 unit complex, I think it's the third largest apartment complex in the region, was filled with, had very affordable rents, filled with lower income households, lots of Latino residents, disabled people, people on government programs. New ownership came in with national investors as a partner. They purchased the property, they imposed 40% rent increases, they added amenities like a pet spa and a golf simulator. They required all the existing tenants to reapply under much tougher admission standards, and they stopped all involvement in government programs, including Section 8. The upshot was that eventually virtually all of those residents had to leave, and that meant we had lost an affordable housing resource of 700 units, which essentially wiped out all of the gains we had made in new affordable housing production in the region in 2014 in one fell swoop. We represented residents and Homeline and brought a class action lawsuit under the Fair Housing Act on behalf of Crossroads residents against the new owners. Ultimately obtained a settlement, but we were not able to save the housing. So that is kind of the prime example of the problem we're facing. This slide is courtesy of the Minnesota Housing Partnership, and it shows two things. It shows how the price of apartment buildings, when they've been up for sale, have escalated, and it shows how rents have escalated. So the top line, the one that indicates of an increase of 78% between 2009 and 2015 is the average cost per apartment when a building is sold. And you can see a very rapid rise. The interesting thing is in 2015, where the average was $86,000 per unit, I just had a conversation with someone familiar with a lot of these buildings being sold right now. And so some of the nonprofit affordable housing providers like Aon and Common Bond that are attempting to compete and purchase these properties are now putting in bids at like $120,000 per unit. And they're still losing these properties because big national investors are coming in and they're willing to buy them for $150,000 per unit. So it just shows you how the problem is continuing to escalate. And the lower line, the light blue line, shows you the rise in rent increases in this 5-6 year period, up 15%. With a 2% vacancy rate, the Twin Cities has as tight a rental market as exists anywhere in the country. This is one person's view of kind of the long-term history of how populations get pushed around within a region. And hopefully you can read this. Essentially, the idea here is that once minorities moved into the cities, then we had white flight out to the suburbs. Whites moved farther out, and minorities move into the first ring suburbs saying, this is better, I guess. And then whites move back in. It worked. Rather cynical view, but you can see why people might see a lot of truth in this kind of theory. The other interesting thing is, this is from 1998, 20 years ago. This is the set of strategies that we talk about in our report, and I'll just run through the list very quickly now, and then we will get into each of them in much more detail. The first three involve what we can do about the supply of NOAA or naturally occurring affordable housing. One key strategy is try to help nonprofits purchase these properties and keep them affordable. The second one is create incentives so these current NOAA landlords choose to keep their properties affordable rather than taking advantage of the highest rents the market allows. And finally, how can we protect tenants in NOAA housing? In addition, there are issues from displacement resulting from redevelopment. We will get into that, both redevelopment where government is involved and government is not involved. Then we'll touch on a key tool that local governments have, which is the use restrictions they impose when they give out their money. We'll talk about preserving manufactured home parks, protecting homeowners from escalating property taxes, and finally, a protection against eviction called just cause eviction. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to the other graybeard presenter. Hi, is my thing working? Yeah. Okay, let me start by saying I hate the term naturally occurring affordable housing. It's supposed to mean affordable housing that hasn't been government subsidized in any way. But it sounds like it's God-given or the result of natural selection instead of being basically the product of greed. But I can't think of another term, so I'm going to go ahead and use NOAA today. Also, it's the one that's on our slides. And, so, let's go back to this one. One of the strategies that's been most effective in preserving federally subsidized affordable housing over the last couple of decades, as owners have tried to opt out of the federal programs in order to turn their project's market rate, has been getting preservation-oriented buyers to buy the properties and keep them affordable for the long term. And over the last couple of years, that sort of strategy has started to be implemented by at least some of the larger nonprofits in the metro area and at least a few governmental entities. In addition to nonprofits and public entities attempting to buy the properties, there's at least there's one effort to provide funding that's currently in existence, the NOAA Impact Fund, operated by the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, provides low interest subordinate financing. That fund has primarily financed the acquisition of large complexes, several hundred units. But a lot of the properties that are being lost are in much smaller buildings, which is much, and those are, the purchase of those is much harder to fund using national equity or national financial resources. The Greater Minnesota Housing Fund is working on an alternative, and Minneapolis is working with LISC and the Family Housing Fund also on an alternative. These efforts, you saw the escalating purchase prices that Tim was talking about. And if you try to match a purchase price of $100,000 a year, you're going to need a lot of money, and that money is going to cost you, and that means rents that are much higher than you want them to be. And in addition to somehow trying to acquire properties at these prices and still keep the rents generally affordable, there's a need to have money quickly. Owners who are anxious to sell and make a bucket aren't willing to wait for a year while you find tax credits or line up bank financing. So there's it's a big job, and so I'm going to talk quickly about a few public policies that are in effect nationally to make it a little bit easier. I want to point out, though, that all these efforts have tended to focus on trying to keep the housing affordable at 60% of the area median income. And that's a struggle given the kind of prices preservation buyers are looking at, but 60% area median income is not very affordable. In Hennepin County, there are over 42,000 renter households paying more than half their income for rent. And of those, 96% have incomes at 50% of AMI or below,
And in fact, the vast majority of them have incomes at 30% of AMI or below. I'm saying this only to make the point that preservation acquisitions are a good idea, and maybe to some extent stemming the tide, but something else is very dramatically needed. A big pool of housing subsidy money. And people are finally starting to talk about that, but it's something that absolutely has to happen on a major scale if this problem is really going to be addressed in a really substantial way. I'm going to talk about 3 types of public policies that are in effect nationally aimed at helping preservation buyers acquire affordable housing. None of these are currently in effect in the metro area. The first is right of first refusal laws. And what a right of first refusal law does is it provides a preservation buyer the absolute right to match a market rate buyer's offer to purchase property. In the private market, at least, that match has to be absolute, word for word. Minnesota has 2 right of first refusal laws, one for foreclosed farm property from the farm crisis in the late 70s, and the other for manufactured home parks that are closing. There are a number of cities have, or a few cities shown on the slide have right of first refusal ordinances with respect to federally subsidized housing. And there's some anecdotal evidence that suggests that these laws do work some of the time. Most of the evidence we've got is from lawsuits that have been filed where the preservation buyers were successful. Suggests that at least some of the time these right of first refusal laws work. The Minnesota manufactured home park right of first refusal law has been tested twice. Both times it didn't work. It's terribly drafted. In fact, it's ridiculously drafted. But even if it were well drafted, there are some problems that are just inherent in a right of first refusal law. Because the preservation buyer has to match an agreement that's already been reached between the seller and a market rate buyer. And often those agreements take months and months to develop, with the prospective buyer having months and months, therefore, of due diligence to figure out what's going on with the property, to think about how it can be financed, to think about potential problems and solutions to potential problems. All of that before there's any kind of offer that triggers a preservation buyer being involved. And the preservation buyer loses all of that time. They have to meet whatever additional time the market rate buyer has given themselves in a purchase agreement or other similar document. In addition, the buyer and seller have had months to figure out ways to make sure that a preservation buyer doesn't get to exercise the right of first refusal, if that's what they want. And even if they haven't, conspired to cook up provisions to put into their agreement that has to be matched, often very perfectly reasonable provisions that make sense between the seller and a market rate buyer don't make sense for a preservation buyer. In the Lowry Grove manufactured home park case, for instance, the park was going to be closed by the developer who was buying the property. So they needed a manager for the 9 months that the park would remain open under state law. And so the purchase agreement said, you're gonna be our management agent. Well, Aon was the white knight nonprofit that the tenants asked to step in and exercise their first refusal rights. And of course, they don't want the old owner to be managing the park for the first 9 months of their ownership. They put that, so they left that out of the purchase agreement they submitted, and of course that's a difference. And if the law turns out to be, if a court finds that no, the match has to be perfect between what the market rate buyer offered and what the preservation buyer offered, then they're gonna lose. So there's statutes I've seen around the country have tried to address these sorts of issues, limiting earnest money payments, for instance. In the Lowry Grove case, the earnest money requirement was $1 million for a $6 million deal, an unheard of percentage. Or imposing a minimum due diligence period of, say, 2 or 3 months. But I think it's really pretty hard, difficult, maybe even impossible, to structure a right of first refusal law that's full bulletproof. The second kind of law that's in effect nationally is the opportunity to purchase statute. And 2 examples of that have received a lot of publicity and apparently are working really well are a New Hampshire state law for manufactured home parks and a District of Columbia ordinance that allows renters in any kind of rental housing a right of first refusal anytime their housing is going to be sold. It also allows the district a right of first refusal for properties that are essentially NOAA housing. And the way that's defined in the Washington ordinance is that 20% of the units have to be affordable at 50% of their median income or below. The notice requirements, so the way the law works is the owner has to give the tenants notice that there is a potential for a sale to happen, say 60, 80, 90, 180 days. And in that period, the residents or a nonprofit that they've selected to work with them has the opportunity to negotiate in good faith for a purchase agreement. The upside of or the downside rather of the opportunity to purchase type statute is that there's no legal right other than for a good faith negotiation. There's no ultimate hammer if the seller decides not to go with the preservation buyer. The upside is that these laws seem to have worked in a pretty big way, at least in New Hampshire and the district. The third type of law is a notice law that provides notice to the residents and to local government that a project is going to be lost or sold. And these laws have been really useful in the federal context, where the notice period is, I think it's 6 to 9 months for the old Section 236 mortgage properties, and it's a year for project-based Section 8 properties. In Minnesota, over the last 2 decades, there have been a lot of properties purchased by nonprofits as a result of this sort of advance notice. There are also state laws Minnesota has a tenant impact statement law that matches the federal 1-year requirement, adds a couple of pieces of information that are not required in the federal law. And there are a few local laws, Portland, Denver, San Francisco, that also have advance notice requirements in their city ordinances that cover not just federally assisted projects in the cities, but also locally assisted projects. The only NOAA ordinance that we're aware of, advance notice law we're aware of, is in Seattle, and it's not, doesn't seem to be designed to be very effective. It applies only to projects that are actually listed with a broker, and the only remedy for violating the law is a modest fine. There are Minneapolis council members that are working on a draft ordinance. A local ordinance, so a couple of things that'll have to be done in order to make something like this work. First of all, you have to define what a NOAA property is. Something like the definition that's used in the opportunity to purchase ordinance in DC. The city is going to have some way of knowing what properties are actually meet that definition. Probably with information that's mandatorily provided with the city licensing. And the final thing that we've realized is that an ordinance like this needs to exclude preservation buyers. In other words, there doesn't have to be the advance notice for a preservation buyer. The reason is if the notice requirement applied to preservation buyers, then as soon as a preservation buyer approached a potential seller, there would be a notice, and every vulture in the metro area would be looking to raise the price. We have yet to see any of these things showing up in the metro areas. As I said, Minneapolis is working on the advance notice, but that's about it. The second thing I'm going to talk about briefly is displacement by public projects. As Tim mentioned, a number of metro area cities are becoming aware of the problem of displacement from privately owned projects. Most of those cities are not so anxious to take effective steps to deal with displacement from their own projects, Minneapolis being one. The Federal Uniform Relocation Act sort of provides the gold standard for how people who are going to be displaced by public projects should be treated. At least it's a standard that's been around for decades. And the key provisions are there has to be sufficient advance notice to the residents that something's going to happen. Tell them who's going to do it and who to talk to for advice. No displacement until there's comparable relocation housing made available to each person who's going to be displaced. Payment of reasonable moving expenses, which typically run, the payments typically run something like $1,800 to $2,000. Replacement housing payments for tenants and owners. The maximum replacement housing payment, and this is essentially additional equity for a displaced owner to try to find financing for their for replacement housing, is $31,000. For tenants, it's 42 months of increased rent, but only to a maximum of $7,200. There is, however, a last resort provision that says if comparable housing can't be found within those payment limits, then the payment limits go away. And in the metro area, in many projects that, in fact, around the state, in many projects that those payment limits have gone away and people have received substantially more than, say, $7,200 or $31,000. There's a second federal law that's important. It's called it's Section 104D of the Community Development Act. And it provides that people that are displaced either by home projects or CDBG projects get to choose either to be covered by the Uniform Act or by 104D, which provides payments that the rental payments for renters, rental payments are reduced to 30% of their income for 60 months. Unfortunately, 104D doesn't apply to block grant funded code enforcement, which is a thing in Minneapolis. In the Minneapolis licensing ordinance provides that if an owner loses licenses on two properties, they lose all their licenses. And for some owners, that's 30 or 40 or 50 properties. And all of a sudden, you've got residents of 30 or 40, 50 homes. Oh, and the ordinance also says the city then has to tell people that they have to move. So all of a sudden, with a landlord like Mahmoud Khan recently, you have 50 households faced with displacement by the city, basically as a result of CDBG-funded code enforcement efforts. And unfortunately, 104D has been, at least HUD has determined that it doesn't apply. One other thing that's interesting about 104D, public agencies that receive home or block grant funds have to annually certify, that is, say, I swear that they're following a residential anti-displacement and relocation assistance plan. So I asked Minneapolis for a copy of their plan. It took them 3 weeks to find it. It was from 1989. It relies on requirements of a regulation that was in effect in 1989 and isn't anymore. And the person who supplied it to me said, we're not really sure that this is the most recent one. So for the last since 1989, Minneapolis has been certifying to the federal government that they not only have, but are following this plan that they didn't even know where it was or what it says or if it's been changed. If there isn't any relocation, if there isn't any federal funding for public projects in Minnesota, it's a much different picture. There is a state Uniform Relocation Act that mirrors all of the protections and benefits of the federal act, but it only applies if a government entity actually acquires the property. The federal act applies if the federal government acquires the property or pays any money that's involved in acquiring the property. And the difference is huge. Tax increment projects, for instance, typically don't provide any, even though they provide substantial sums of money to developers who may well be displacing large numbers of people, they're excluded from the coverage of the State Uniform Act because a public agency isn't actually acquiring the property. Recently in Rochester, as part of the big Mayo Clinic downtown development district, at least one 50-unit apartment complex with largely low income, largely minority residents was acquired, demolished, everybody displaced, no help at all from the city. No counseling, no help finding places, and no money at all. Manufactured home park closures have some relocation payment assistance for people who move their homes, but they're pretty serious and stringent caps on the amount of money available. And in many cases, and certainly in the Lowry Grove case, the payments were not nearly enough to allow people to find decent, affordable housing. Minneapolis and St. Paul have some relocation policies providing substantially lower protections. For instance, the St. Paul plan, the homeowner assistance is a maximum at $2,000 as opposed to the $31,000 available from the Uniform Relocation Act. So one public policy to address displacement of low-income households really needs to be for cities that are doing the displacement to adopt policies that at least mirror the Uniform Act. Jim?
One thing I wanted to mention before, but forgot I'm going to mention now, which is in our list of strategies to address displacement, one that you did not see there was rent control. And the reason you didn't see it is because there is a state law that makes it extremely difficult to adopt rent control, particularly in cities like Minneapolis. So setting aside the merits of how well rent control works and whether the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, there's some real practical, difficult barriers to adopting it in Minnesota, which is why we didn't focus on it in the report. Getting back to NOAA property, and because we can't expect nonprofit preservation buyers to buy up all the NOAA housing, how can we create incentives for current owners to keep their properties affordable? And so this is where the 4D program, as it's called, which refers to the part of the statute it originates from, comes into play. This is a part of the property tax statute, and it provides that owners can get property tax breaks of 40% on their rental properties in exchange for rent and income restrictions at 60% AMI. Traditionally, this has just been applied to subsidized housing in Minnesota, but we noticed several years ago that it can be applied more broadly. As long as an owner agrees to rent and income restrictions and there is financial assistance from even the local government level, it can qualify, and there's no minimum needed for that level of financial assistance. So in effect, local governments are free to structure local 4D programs to create this kind of incentive. When we studied this a few years ago, the tax savings for owners was not quite enough to be an incentive to sign up for rent restrictions. But since that time, property taxes on rental properties have gone up enough. It's a big deal for owners, and they're increasingly getting very interested in this. Minneapolis in the last year has adopted a pilot program, got a strong response. Number of owners signed up. So under their program, at least 20% of your units have to remain within 60% AMI rents for 10 years. And the city is now planning on rolling out a bigger version of this program in the next year, and we know a lot of suburban cities are interested as well. So this seems like a real promising approach. In addition to situations where there is redevelopment with some government involvement that Jack was talking about, a lot of redevelopment, of course, happens without any government involvement. And so what can local governments do in those situations? Traditionally, local governments think that they have strings where they're giving out money But I think it's also important that cities think about where they have leverage when they are giving significant land use approvals as well. So there may be an opportunity to attach some protections when they're doing that. Those are mostly, though, new construction projects for the future, so they don't help a lot with NOAA. But there are other things that cities can do, and they should not overlook the power of informal intervention. In the city of Richfield, after the Crossroads Apartments experience, a very similar apartment building came up for sale. Seasons Park, the same owner that had purchased Crossroads was in final negotiations to purchase Seasons Park, evidently with the same plan to upscale it. Several city council members jumped into action along with Aon and others and convinced the owner at the last minute to call off his negotiations with that purchaser and instead sell it to Aon. So, and that was simply local government officials working the phone, calling people up, mobilizing support. That's an important role to play. And finally, cities have a set of traditional police powers where they can enact regulations to protect tenants. So cities around the country have required relocation benefits to be paid where owners are taking actions that displace tenants. Advance notice gives tenants more time. Several cities in the metro area have now adopted 90-day tenant protection ordinances, which provide that when a NOAA property is sold, for the first 90 days, the owner has to forego rent increases or evictions without cause, or he can choose to pay relocation benefits. So that is one protection that is starting to get a lot of adoption around the region. And then finally, another area where local governments can open up opportunities and expand access is protection against discriminating against Section 8 housing choice voucher holders. The city of Minneapolis recently enacted an ordinance which provided that protection. A group of landlords sued. The trial court, in a really kind of unorthodox decision, found fault with the ordinance and overturned it. That's now up on appeal in the Minnesota Court of Appeals. But if that ordinance ultimately gets upheld, we know a number of other cities are interested in adopting that same kind of protection. The other key thing that cities typically rely on when they give out their money is a set of use restrictions which attach to the property in exchange. So here it's basically a bargain in which the local government is trying to get as much value to serve public purposes as they can in exchange for their money. So typically it comes down to how many of the units will be affordable, at what level of affordability, and particularly for how long. And cities often find themselves in a position where they've negotiated an agreement and suddenly those 15 years came real quickly and now they're faced with those restrictions expiring and having the problem all over again. In addition to structuring those use restrictions, it's really important for local governments to monitor their supply of restricted housing and to keep track of when those restrictions are expiring. The big issue that we've worried about for a long time in the last several decades is owners opting out of Section 8, project-based Section 8 contracts. And that's still an issue in some cases, not as much as it was before. But the big thing that is looming for the future is when we start to see our low-income housing tax credits reaching their 30-year end of affordability, which is going to start hitting in a big way in the mid-2020s. And we don't yet have a solution for that. So local governments need to monitor, they need to engage with owners, they need to make sure they're getting maximum protections in their use restrictions. And I'd say the two areas where local governments are revisiting their use restrictions these days is attempting to negotiate longer restrictive periods, typically 30 years rather than 15 or as much as they can get. And then making sure that these properties that are getting public money open themselves up to Section 8, which means not just committing to taking vouchers, but making sure some of the rents are within voucher limits and that they're actually affirmatively marketing vacant units to voucher holders. Manufactured home park communities. They are threatened both by redevelopment pressures, which was the situation with Lowry Grove and St. Anthony Village, and also frequently by deteriorating infrastructure, which requires big investments, which too many owners have put off. So those are kind of both threats to the supply. As Jack mentioned, the most prominent recent situation is the Lowry Grove Manufactured Home Park in St. Anthony Village. Recently closed down. The residents' effort to make a right of first refusal work in that case failed, and the courts ruled against them. But there are some things that cities can do. The first one, as I say, is simply do no harm. For example, in its comprehensive plan, the city of St. Anthony Village said that the Lowry Grove site, this was 10 years ago, the Lowry Grove site was a prime site for redevelopment, in effect creating a bullseye on that manufactured home park and signaling to developers that the city was interested in seeing it go away. So what we've been urging a lot of cities to do as they rewrite their comp plans this year is have, in effect, statements of support for their manufactured home parks, recognizing it's a vital part of their community and something that needs to be preserved. There's some interesting zoning strategies that have come out of Washington State, where several cities have enacted ordinances that said a manufactured home park cannot be rezoned unless the owner can demonstrate to the city that it is no longer economically viable to redevelop that manufactured home park. In that case, the owner challenged that ordinance and went all the way up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The court upheld the ordinance, said it was a valid action for the city to take. So that's an interesting zoning strategy that I think cities ought to look at in some cases. When parks do close, cities have a role in the process. They select the person who oversees payment of relocation benefits. They're also supposed to review the closure. They even have the ability to add additional compensation for residents in situations where it's inadequate. They cannot impose it on the park owner, but the city could choose to produce that money themselves. And then finally, taking proactive measures, preventive measures, to make sure the parks don't get to the place where they face such serious problems. Local government, cities and counties, in some situations, provide assistance to enable people to rehab their homes or replace their homes when they're really old homes, and assistance financing for park infrastructure can also be a key step to take. One of the issues we were asked to look at is, what about low-income homeowners on fixed incomes who are facing rising property taxes and having difficulty coping with them? And what we found when we looked into this is there's actually quite a number of state programs that can assist with property taxes in a variety of circumstances, either lower tax rates, tax refunds, or tax deferrals, and that can, depending on the program and the particular form of relief, can be available to lower value homes, lower income taxpayers, seniors, blind and disabled vets. So it seemed to us that the main thing here is there did not seem to be any one place that collected all of this information. So simply someone that creates an informational piece so that low-income homeowners know this array of programs available to them would probably be a pretty simple and useful step to take. Finally, evictions. One of the problems is that a lot of evictions can take place without the tenant knowing why. Because owners can simply choose to not renew the lease or give a 30-day notice in case of a month-to-month. And this can be a real problem for tenants. It's a common strategy when new owners come in and want to upscale buildings, and it's also a great way for owners who want to retaliate against tenants who are asserting their rights. There is a protection in state law against retaliatory eviction, but the only way a tenant can assert that is to go to eviction court, which not only creates risk, but it means even if they prevail, they have the eviction on their record. So Just Cause would help It's a very common requirement in subsidized housing. A number of states and cities require it in private housing as well. But the big problem with evictions, of course, is something that Just Cause doesn't really help with, which is that 90% of all evictions are for non-payment of rent. It's basically an economic problem. One thing that would really help that Minnesota lacks, that a number of other states have, is a notice that when you've not paid your rent, that before evicting, the landlord has to give you a 10-day notice to pay or vacate. The beauty of that is that it not only allows tenants more time to come up with the money, but it allows them to coordinate with the county emergency assistance program so that we can get some funds in there to keep people in their homes. One way to fix this is amend state law. But an intriguing idea that has recently surfaced that's under discussion in Minneapolis right now is when a landlord applies for a rental license, the city would require the landlord to add a mandatory lease addendum to the lease that could add certain tenant protections, including perhaps a 10-day pay or quit notice. So it's an interesting idea. It still needs some analysis, but it might be a way to make a real difference there. So this is clearly still an evolving area. Cities across the country are struggling to find effective tools here. A number of the things we've talked about are kind of emerging strategies. The legal landscape is still unsettled. So this is kind of a subject to be continued. The report, we've got the link to the report here, and we urge you to take a look and would welcome any feedback